It's important we come back to this. Andrew Doyle, the writer and comedian whose new book about free speech is out. I think it's literally out today. I've got a copy of it. We'll talk to Andrew a little later, just on this very obvious issue that you would think, well, here we are, 21st century, 2021. This might not be a thing. It's never been more of a thing, certainly in my lifetime. So those who bat politically from the right will say, I think correctly so, that we're in a kind of perilous minefield with regards to the fundamental right of freedom of speech. Anyone with even a superficial understanding of the human journey when it comes to different systems of government and the dictatorship, fascism, totalitarianism will know just how the right to have your voice heard, no matter how objectionable it might be to some people, is one of the most basic building blocks, the most basic building block of a free and civilized society. I mean, the Americans have this beautifully reflected in their constitution. Meanwhile, over in the left of the political spectrum, that group will tell you there's nothing to see here because there's nothing wrong with trying to counter people being horrible and offensive. And in any case, they will argue, the stories are so few and far between, there's no real case for debate here. They claim the Gammons and the Karens of this world are just a bit miffed because they can't have a pop at a bloke in a frock. That seems to be it. Why is this happening? 0344 499 1000. I should say at the outset, the left are wrong, the right are, well, right on this one. Why is this happening? There are so many elements and strands to this story. Let's just try and bring some of it together, which even includes Mr. Potato Head. I'll come to that in a few moments. But when you consider the amount of hysteria, the amount of headlines and discussions about freedom of speech and cancellation and who can't say what, and it's not, there's no suggestion we are currently in a dictatorship where you cannot say nothing. That isn't the suggestion here. But free speech has to be kept in check. The right to free speech fundamentally has to be reviewed and kept in check on a very regular basis. We should never, ever take our eye off that particular ball. So when I hear the left start squealing and saying, well, there's nothing to see here, look, all you people saying there's no such thing as free speech are on the radio or writing columns about the fact there's no such thing as free speech, and here you are talking about it. Clearly, you're wrong. No, that doesn't give us the answer. That does not give us the answer. Let me run through some of this, because there's such a body of evidence now and a litany of disturbing cases of people whose speech has not just been curtailed or cancelled, but investigated by the state, law enforcement, debated in Parliament, laws about to change. So I would say to the left that to ignore that is not just a bit daft. It would be frankly criminal to ignore that. I mean, the Scottish hate crime bill kind of tells you everything you need to know. More of that in a few moments. But just to give you a taste, I think, of how bonkers this is. Once again, and I think we could all agree, we've all read the stories around this, but just to give you a taster, if somebody had said to you 10 years ago, name somebody who will become a kind of big figure of hate, someone who's stirring the pot of evil and doing unsavoury and hateful things, someone who's pretty vile to their very core, who would you have thought? I mean, you might have gone Kim Jong-un. I mean, that could have been a guess there, maybe possibly the Castro brothers. I know that divides the room, but you take my point. Putin would be on the list, right? President Xi would be there. You can imagine taking an educated guess who is likely to be public enemy number one when it comes to being a very hateful person indeed. Any of the above I've just mentioned there. The person you would never expect to be on that list is the woman who wrote Harry Potter, right? I mean, the woman who wrote J.K. Rowling, public enemy number one. How is this happening? I gave a Chris Morris analogy yesterday when we were talking about unconscious bias, about how you can kind of imagine that the unconscious bias game is just something invented by Chris Morris. And the kind of Morris analogy is ripe again, really, to be applied here. J.K. Rowling. It's like J.K. Rowling, public figure of hate. That's like discovering the Queen is a skunk dealer, or Mother Teresa works nights at Stringfellows. I mean, it's just so nonsensical. It just doesn't make any sense at all. J.K. Rowling, that what, the same J? Is there another J? No, that J.K. Rowling, that one. Really? What is happening here? Over in Holyrood, when they're not interviewing Alex Salmond, they're busy cooking up plans for a new hate crime law, the Scottish Hate Crime Bill, the proposed law which will make stirring up hatred against certain groups a criminal offence, even if a person making the remarks is not intending to do that or even made them in private. Right, how does that work? So you're talking about something with your friends, somebody overhears this, or somebody spills the beans, that makes them go into a hyperventilating frenzy and get all horrible to people, and therefore you go to jail for stirring things up even though you didn't know you'd stirred things up. This is Humza Yousaf, the SNP Justice Secretary over there in the People's Republic of Edinburgh, has described the legislation as an important milestone in the fight against prejudice. And by the way, just as an interesting caveat to all of this, all these things that the SNP are apparently concerned about is already covered by existing law. You don't need another hate crime law. It's already illegal to smash people around the face because of their colour, because of their sexuality, gender, or anything else for that matter. You can't just libel people at will. You can't incite a riot, but you can have an opinion that might be counter to somebody else's. Why is this happening? Bearing in mind, you don't meet anybody in real life that believes any of these things. Do you actually know anyone that thinks J.K. Rowling really is a figure of hate and has been mischievous and nefarious in her endeavours when she talks about women's rights and she talks about the trans issue? If you read her beautifully crafted blog that she wrote in order to try and address the very thing she'd been accused of, all that did was made the haters double down. They gave her even more stick on this. So meanwhile, back in England, this brings us back to the Harry Miller story, or what could be called now, we need to check your thinking story. That very line, we need to check your thinking, was said to the businessman Harry Miller by a police officer after a complaint was made about something he put onto social media. The police officer attending Harry's house told him that what he'd written online was transphobic. Now, you might think at this point, dear old Harry was up to his neck in it. Curiously, he wasn't, because legally speaking, he'd not done anything wrong. The officer explained no crime had been committed. He'd done nothing illegal. So why was there a copper standing on his doorstep? I should just at this point say that Harry himself is a former police officer. The officer told him that whilst what he'd written was not illegal, it does qualify as a non-crime hate incident. Yes, you heard that correctly, a non-crime hate incident. I mean, that's a line that could have been written by Orwell or Huxley or Atwood. A non-crime hate incident. 0344 499 1000. Why is this happening? We don't know anybody that believes this stuff. We don't know anybody who concurs. We never meet anyone who says, yeah, that's right what happened to dear old Harry. Good that JK is in the doghouse. It's fabulous that we have the Mr. Potato. I mean, let's just talk about him, because even the Mr. Potato story has a place in this discussion. So Mr. Potato is going to become, what's he going to become? Potato. Just a potato. It's a bit rubbish, isn't it? So when you buy the box, does it just say potato on it? Does it say something else? Potato head. But no Mr. or Mrs. Because you thought that Mr. Potato was a Mr. Oh, no. He's gender neutral, isn't he? They. I said they. Your Honour, I said they. They are gender neutral. You thought there might be a little chippy chip hanging there beneath Mr. Potato Head, proving that he is a man. There is no little chippy chip there. No. He's not a man, he's not a woman, he's a nothing. We're not a nothing, Your Honour. I don't mean like he's nothing. I'm not saying gender neutral people are nothing, okay? I'm saying he's just like Mr. Potato Head, Your Honour, in my defence, etc. And here's the bit that really got me here. So Hasbro, the toy-making company, the managing director, the general manager, Kimberly Boyd, said this: the Mr. and Mrs. brand was limiting when it comes to gender. Limiting? What, you mean something that 99% of the world understand and are, is limiting? Really? So I could now find myself, and by the way, who gave Hasbro the right to redefine what the family unit looks like, what biology actually is? Nobody at all. They're preening their whiskers here. So I could now find myself in a peculiar position of committing a hate crime by suggesting Mr. Potato Head is a bloke. Is that where we're at? By the way, whatever they tell you, I'm going to risk it here. Is this an Ofcom moment? Marta, are we going to have our first Ofcom moment? I think we are. Mr. Potato Head is a bloke. He's a man. He's all man. He couldn't be more man. Half of him is just testosterone. Did you know? That's how much of a man he is. There's no girliness in Mr. Potato Head. He's just a 100% pure pedigree bloke. He couldn't be more of a bloke if he grew another little chippy down there as well. That's how much of a man Mr. Potato Head is. So when they tell you at Hasbro is actually gender neutral, just ignore them. It's Mr. Potato Head. There is a Mrs. Potato Head, by the way. And she's a girl. A proper girl. Like he's a man, okay? Man, girl, potatoes. That's how you do it. Hasbro tell us differently. Could you be in for a visit from the law like Harry was if I were to post that online that I think Mr. Potato... This is how crazy this is. And I just want to know why this is happening. What's the reason? I would understand this if you walked into an office, like we could walk into an office, in our office, and we could debate myriad things on a daily basis. Half of us might think this, another half might think that. You never meet anybody with any of these views about the Scottish hate crime bill, about J.K. Rowling, about dear old Harry, or Mr. Potato Head. Nobody, thinks these things. So why are they changing laws? Why are institutions accommodating this? Why are organisations, even government departments, sending people on courses, changing language, addressing issues that are of concern to absolutely nobody? It's the why I'm interested in. Andrew Doyle with us a little later on. He might be able to help us out here on this one. But we will in a few moments actually have that conversation with Harry Miller, the former cop who found himself faced with a police officer on his doorstep saying, well, you've got to check your thinking. Has anybody thought how awful that sounds? You've got to check your thinking. Thank you, Mr. Orwell. Now, after the news that Mr. Potato Head is going to go gender neutral and the backlash faced by critics of the decision, we're looking at the state of freedom of speech in this country. The truth is that we keep talking about the subject. Since last year, J.K. Rowling has been subjected to an unrelenting campaign for her concerns that self-identification of gender might compromise women-only spaces. Another example, veteran presenter Alistair Stewart, sometimes of this parish, was forced to resign after tweeting a quotation from Shakespeare which included the phrase angry ape, and because he tweeted that to a black guy, therefore it was seen. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Therefore, it could only have been racist. It couldn't have been that he happens to send that same quote to lots of people, which, as it turns out, he does. Let's speak to Harry Miller, our next guest, investigated for sharing a poem online that was deemed transphobic. The police turned up, and it's interesting because it turned out to be a non-hate crime. Help me out here, Harry. What did they call it?
They call it a non-crime crime. A non-crime hate incident.
A non-crime hate incident. That's the word. A non-crime hate incident. Yes. Yeah. So
now it wasn't just a limerick. And the truth is, I know you were joking when you said, "Is it going to be a crime to misgender
Mr. Potato Head?"
I almost said Mr. Potato Head. Then, well,
don't say that.
The fact of the matter is, if you do misgender Mr. Potato Head, there I did it again. You are eligible to be recorded as a hater. And the reason that I know this is because one of the things that I was recorded as a hater for saying was this. I said that I was assigned mammal at birth, but I identify as fish. And this was classed as being so outrageously transphobic that the police were required to come and knock at my door and stop me tweeting such things because it was very likely going to escalate into me stabbing somebody. So don't even think about misgendering Potato Head because, Ian, the fact is this. Trans women are women, trans men are men, and non-binary potato heads are valid. And if you disagree, you can expect a knock at the door from the thought police.
And told to check your thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Check your thinking, check your pronouns, check your speech. check all of these things. Now, you're absolutely right. Nobody believes any of this. Nobody. But there's an entire industry that is being run by Stonewall and being run by this bloated organisation called the College of Policing, which has to find hate even when there is no hate.
Yeah.
And this is the reason that they paraded a 10-foot billboard around the car park of Asda earlier this week, saying that being offensive is an offence. Well, of
This
course
was
it's
in
not an
Merseyside, of course, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's never been an offence. How on earth does a police force spend 750 quid to tell a massive, great big lie to the people of the Wirral?
Yeah.
How do they do that? Well, the reason they do it is because they have to generate more and more hate. And where hate doesn't exist, they invent some. So we can fully expect there to be a special division of the police.
But here's the thing, Harry. I mean, if I sat down and had a pint with the copper that knocked at your door and said you'd committed a non-hate, what's it called again? It's a non-crime hate incident. If I sat and had a pint with him, he would probably tell me that he knows this is also cobblers, and his boss knows that as well.
I'm not so sure. You see, there's a police force within a police force that we have now. We have regular bobbies who don't believe any of this nonsense. And then we have this ideological police force who absolutely do believe it. I mean, I remember him saying to me with absolute sincerity, what you've got to understand, Mr. Miller, is that sometimes in the womb, a female brain accidentally grows the wrong body parts. And that's what being trans is. And I said, you've got to be kidding me, mate. And he said, no, I've been on a course. And the guy was being honest.
Wow.
Yeah, he believed it. He absolutely believed it. And the thing is, he's free to believe that, but he is coercing us also into believing it, because if we don't believe it, we end up with this non-crime hate incident.
And this is the thing. I mean, all this would be fine if it was kind of just confined to a very small area of people who had these beliefs and thought that anything you might say or I might say or anybody else might say, if they want to believe that these things are full of hate, then that's up to them. However, I mentioned this at the beginning. We're talking about the police force here. We're talking about the police. We're talking about governments. We're talking about laws changing, institutions, banks, big corporations. They're all on board with this, Harry. That's the bit that I can't get my head around. They're all on board with something they don't really believe.
Well, the person who was on before me got it absolutely right. They make a false equivalence between racism and homophobia. And they say it's very much like racism, very much like homophobia. You better get on board with all this nonsense.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you're literally a racist and literally a homophobe, and you're literally Hitler. And the police, who are still suffering from a burden of guilt from how badly they behaved over Stephen Lawrence, they take it hook, line, and sinker in order to absolve themselves. That's what this is all about. They're blaming us to try and absolve themselves of their own guilt, their own historical guilt, and it's pathetic. I wonder.
Listen, Harry, it's always good to have you on. Let's speak again on this. That's Harry Miller. We've spoken to Harry a few times on this. He was the guy that, he's there to combat police interference in free speech, but he found himself on the receiving end of it, a knock at the door, and he was told he was guilty of a non-crime hate incident. So he hadn't done anything unlawful, but it was a non-crime hate incident. It's still going to be logged. That's outrageous. That is outrageous, and nobody seems to give a toss about this. Isn't that the funniest thing? Not a hoot. Nowhere along the line is anybody that bothered.